The air in the private antechamber tasted faintly of pine resin and crushed ozone, a bitter combination that clung to the heavy tapestry hangings. Darius stood entirely still before a scarred silver mirror. He did not look at his own eyes. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the high collar of his dark wool tunic, his fingers moving with deliberate precision as he fastened the top iron hooks. The thick fabric rose just beneath his jawline, a calculated barrier designed to conceal the faint, jagged lines of old border skirmishes and the subtle, undeniable signs of an aging throat. Darius Vaughan occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. Today, that silence felt heavier than usual. It settled in his chest like iron, sinking through deep water, dense and absolute. He reached for the heavy silver sovereign signet resting on the oak washstand. The metal was brutally cold against his skin. He slid it onto his index finger, feeling the familiar, restrictive bite of the band. It was a physical reminder of the weight of the citadel, a weight he had carried alone for over 2 decades. Beneath his ribs, the ancient, restless energy of his wolf paced in slow, frustrated circles. Darius began to count his heartbeats. 1. The rhythm was steady, though elevated by the looming pressure of the High Council. 2. He forced his breathing to shallow out, deliberately pulling the cold northern air down into his lungs until the beast's pacing slowed into a reluctant, heavy stillness. 3. He would not allow biology or pack instinct to dictate his composure in the great hall. He turned toward the heavy oak door leading to the corridor. On the table beside it lay a sealed copy of the morning's agenda, culminating in the singular, unalterable declaration he was about to make. For years, the elders had pressured him to add a second name to the bloodline registry, the massive iron-clasped ledger that recorded the lineage of the sovereign court. They demanded a mate to secure the political stability of the territories. Darius had finally reached his limit. The frantic search for a fated bond belonged to the young, to men who still believed biology was a substitute for strategy and mutual respect. His blood had grown too cold for the heat of an unearned claiming. He would walk into the council hall, take his seat at the head of the long stone table, and formally declare himself beyond the age of mating. He would rule alone, leaving the succession to the administrative mechanisms he had perfected. He pressed his thumb against the face of his ring, grounding himself in the sharp reality of the engraved crest. The choice was made. He exhaled a long breath, the faint white mist dissipating against the cold draught, and pushed the door open to face the waiting court. High above the polished marble floor of the great hall, the registry gallery smelled of dry dust, melting beeswax, and the sharp, acidic tang of iron gall ink. Clara Vance sat in the shadows of the arched stone balcony, perfectly still, letting the ambient noise of the gathering council wash over her without demanding her attention. She did not lean over the carved stone balustrade to look at the powerful men entering below. Instead, she kept her focus strictly on the narrow wooden desk bolted to the gallery wall. Her hands moved with the practiced, economic efficiency of a woman who knew exactly how much space she was allowed to occupy. Clara aligned 3 sharpened goose-feather quills parallel to the edge of her parchment stack. She uncorked the small glass bottle of black ink, checking the viscosity by tilting the glass against the dim light of the flickering wall sconce. Satisfied, she rested her fingertips lightly against the edge of the heavy, iron-clasped volume resting on the adjacent reading stand. The bloodline registry was closed, its ancient leather cover worn smooth by centuries of careful handling. Today, her job was simply to record the minutes of the autumn session, ensuring that every spoken decree was transcribed with absolute grammatical and legal precision. A bitter draught swept through the high gallery, carrying the scent of damp wool and freezing mud from the courtyard outside. Clara shivered slightly, pulling her plain woolen shawl tighter across her shoulders. She wrapped her cold, ink-stained fingers around a thick ceramic mug resting near her inkwell. The chicory tea inside had already begun to lose its heat, but the faint warmth seeping into her palms was enough to steady her knuckles. Down on the main floor, the heavy wooden doors groaned open, and the low, echoing murmur of the pack elders began to fill the cavernous space. Clara observed their posturing with clinical detachment. She watched the lower lords arrange their cloaks, adjust their posture, and exchange tight, calculating smiles that never reached their eyes. From her vantage point in the shadows, the court was not a terrifying assembly of apex predators. It was merely a complex machine of gears and levers, driven by predictable impulses of pride, territorial greed, and fear. She lifted her mug, taking a slow sip of the bitter tea. She had spent enough of her life, learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why, and she applied that same quiet discipline to her work. Here, suspended above the political battlefield, she was invisible. Invisibility was a tactical advantage, a quiet refuge that allowed her to observe the geometries of power without becoming a casualty of them. Clara set the mug down with a soft, barely audible clink against the wood. She picked up her finest quill, tested the tip against her thumb, and dipped it into the dark ink. The elders were taking their seats. She smoothed her hand flat over the blank expanse of the parchment, waiting to turn the chaotic breath of powerful men into permanent history. As the session commenced, Darius Vaughan occupied the center of the great council hall, with the stillness of a compass needle finding north, drawing the attention of every territorial elder without having to raise his voice. He was not a man who commanded through the baring of teeth, but through the precise, terrifying application of jurisdiction. His words were unhurried, devoid of the theatrical aggression that younger sovereigns often relied upon to mask their insecurities. He prepared to deliver the defining mandate of his autumn address, the decree that would formally close the question of his succession and seal the political maneuvering that had plagued his court for a decade. The architecture of the hall, built from dark northern granite and heavy timber, amplified the steady baritone of his delivery, carrying the dry, legalistic syntax up toward the vaulted ceiling and the shadowed galleries above. He carried his physical weight with unyielding stillness, his heavy dark velvet cloak hanging perfectly motionless against his broad shoulders. Therefore, let it be formally entered into the archives that I have passed the years of instinct. I am beyond the age of mating. The throne will require no Luna to secure its authority, and no further petitions for a royal pairing will be entertained. It was a definitive end to an era of whispers. He meant to turn the page of his prepared notes, to conclude the session and dismiss the assembly back to their respective winter territories. But as his chin lifted slightly, his eyes drifted toward the upper registry balcony. He did not mean to look at the scribe. It was merely a physiological shift in posture, a natural elevation of his line of sight toward the gaggery where the kingdom's history was being transcribed. Yet, as his gaze met the dark, observing eyes of Clara Vance, the mechanical rhythm of the sovereign's world fractured. It was not a spark of wild passion. It was the sudden, devastating weight of absolute confirmation settling into his bones like cold water into deep stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack of his engineered isolation. The air in the immense chamber seemed to crystallize, the ambient temperature plummeting sharply as a violent rush of ozone crushed pine needles, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron gall ink flooded his senses. The scent alignment was so profound, so absolute, that the breath vanished entirely from his lungs. Darius froze. For the first time in his reign, the sovereign's voice simply ceased to exist mid-sentence. 1 second passed. The quiet that followed was absolute, possessing a physical density that seemed to press the oxygen out of the room. 2 seconds. Several men shifted uncomfortably in their carved wooden chairs, glancing at each other, waiting for the king to clear his throat, the muscles in his jaw locked into rigid lines, the knuckles of his hands whitening against the edge of the podium. His wolf, a creature long thought dormant beneath decades of administrative discipline, slammed against the inside of his ribs with enough force to shatter iron. 3 seconds. He could have roared. He could have abandoned the podium, ascended the stone stairs to the gallery, and demanded submission from the woman holding the quill in front of the entire assembly. Other men would have done exactly that. Instead, Darius forced his lungs to expand against the crushing pressure in his chest. He gripped the edges of the heavy oak stand until the wood gave a faint, protesting groan, wrestling the sudden, violent biological mandate back into a cage of strict duty. When the Alpha King finally spoke again, his tone was a flat, even drawl, perfectly modulated and terrifyingly calm, betraying absolutely nothing of the internal earthquake that had just torn through his foundation. High above the council floor, Clara kept her head lowered, her ink-stained fingers moving steadily across the heavy registry parchment. She had felt the exact moment his gaze found her. The sudden weight of the sovereign's attention did not just touch her. It dropped over her shoulders like a mantle of lead. The atmospheric shift in the hall was undeniable. The sudden spike of ozone and pine reached the high gallery, cutting through the dusty scent of old paper and beeswax, thick enough to taste on the back of her tongue. She experienced the distinct, cold clarity of a fear realized. The mating pull was a physical tether snapping taut across the vast, drafty space of the council hall, demanding an immediate, visceral response. The instinct to submit, to look down at the man who was meant to be hers, screamed in her blood, but her place was behind the ledgers, invisible, a ghost of ink and wax. She had spent years mastering the art of emotional erasure, and she would certainly not break down in front of a room full of arrogant pack elders. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp intake of freezing air, but she refused to let her hand tremble. A single drop of dark ink threatened to fall from the nib of her quill and ruin the pristine transcription of the king's speech. She carefully, deliberately, pressed the metal tip to the parchment, completing the elegant curve of a consonant. The scratch of the nib against the paper sounded impossibly loud in her own ears, a steady, rhythmic anchoring to reality, while the world below her tilted on its axis. She deliberately avoided looking up a second time. She chose instead to focus entirely on the precise geometry of her handwriting, using the administrative routine as a defensive shield against the crushing pressure of the bond. To look back would be an invitation. To meet his eyes again would be to step out of the shadows of the archive and into the dangerous, volatile arena of pack politics, a place where a low-status archivist would be torn apart by ambitious rivals. Her survival depended on her invisibility, and she would not sacrifice her hard-won autonomy for a biological accident. Down below, the sovereign resumed his speech. His flat, even drawl echoed off the stone walls, completely devoid of the hesitation that had gripped him only moments before. Clara recorded every word. She did not miss a single comma, even as the blood roared in her ears and the scent of the Alpha King wrapped around her wrists like invisible iron cuffs. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She wore it perfectly, building an impenetrable wall of dry ink and legal syntax between herself and the powerful sovereign who had just sworn before his entire court that he would never seek a mate. She would be the scribe of his reign, nothing more, cataloguing the very laws that kept them apart. The echoes of the sovereign's declaration had barely settled into the freezing drafts of the great council hall when the heavy scrape of iron against stone broke the stillness. Elder Marcus Thule stood. He did not ask for the floor. He claimed it with the blunt entitlement of a man who believed raw physical dominance still governed the northern territories. A king who refuses the possibility of an heir is a king who invites the wolves to his borders, Marcus said. His voice was loud, carrying the aggressive resonance of traditional pack authority. He stepped away from the long oak table, gesturing toward the high arches of the ceiling as if calling the ancestors to witness. You declare your blood too cold for a mate, Sovereign. But what of the shattered peaks? What of the southern territories? They respect the continuation of a lineage, not the stubborn isolation of a man who believes he can outlive time itself. The murmurs that rippled through the seated elders were low and cautious. Several men shifted their weight, their eyes darting between the standing elder and the man at the head of the table. Darius Vaughan did not rise to meet the challenge. He remained seated in his high-backed chair, his posture completely still, though the atmosphere in the room tightened until the air felt brittle enough to snap. He reached down, his large, scarred hand coming to rest lightly on the iron hilt of his broadsword. It was not a threat of violence, it was a physical reminder of the law. Article 5 of the Winter Accord. The Sovereign began, his voice pitched so low that every man in the room had to lean forward to hear it. Drafted in the year of the long frost, it stipulates that succession is determined by the Sovereign's appointed regent, validated by the tribunal, and bound by blood oath, not exclusively by direct biological inheritance. Marcus stiffened, his jaw tightening as the legal absolute was laid bare before him. He opened his mouth to argue, but the king held up a single finger. Furthermore, the Sovereign continued, his tone remaining as measured and dry as parchment. The territorial treaties you cite require stability, not the chaotic disruption of a succession war bred by forced matings. My command of the borders is maintained by the standing army and the ink of our ledgers. Neither requires me to sire a child to appease your archaic anxieties, Marcus. The elder's face flushed a dull, dark red. He relied on volume and physical posturing, tools that were entirely useless against a man who wielded administrative precision like a blade. The king's knowledge of the ancestral codes was absolute. He did not need to bare his teeth to prove he commanded the room. He merely cited the text that governed them all. Is there any other elder who wishes to debate the jurisprudence of my retirement? The man at the head of the table asked. The silence that followed swallowed the question whole. Marcus slowly lowered himself back into his iron chair, the heavy thud of his boots the only sound of his defeat. The heavy oak doors of the council hall were finally pulled open, letting in the sharp, biting wind of the northern afternoon. As the elders filed out in subdued groups, their footsteps echoing down the long stone corridors, the Sovereign remained seated for a moment longer. He waited until the last of the council had departed before he turned to the woman standing quietly by the secondary hearth. Alice Thorne had spent 3 decades serving as his senior advisor. Her hands were permanently stained with ink, and her expression was set in its usual mask of gruff, pragmatic realism. She did not offer empty platitudes, nor did she flinch when the air around him grew heavy. Ensure the minutes of this meeting are completed promptly, Darius instructed, his voice finally losing some of its rigid formality. I want the official transcription of my declaration brought to my study by nightfall. As you wish, Sovereign, Alice replied, her sharp eyes studying his profile. Though I suspect you are less concerned with Marcus Thule's objections and more interested in the precise handwriting of the archivist who recorded them. He did not answer her directly. Instead, he rose and walked through the private side door that led to his personal antechamber. The room was cold, lit only by the grey light spilling through a narrow, iron-grated window. A copper basin rested on a wooden stand in the corner, filled with water drawn from the deep wells beneath the citadel. The king stripped off his heavy velvet cloak, tossing it over a chair, and plunged his hands into the freezing water. He splashed it over his face, letting the shocking coldness bite into his skin, trying to wash away the sudden, staggering heat that had bloomed in his chest an hour ago. The scent of ozone, pine, and old ink still clung to the back of his throat. It was a phantom smell, a visceral anchor to the woman sitting in the high gallery. Alice followed him into the antechamber, carrying a dry linen towel. She held it out to him, her expression entirely neutral. You made a very definitive statement to the council today, she observed quietly. You told them your blood had grown too cold for the heat of a fated bond. Darius took the linen, pressing it against his dripping face. He held it there for a long moment, breathing in the smell of plain soap and rough fabric before lowering it. His knuckles were white where he gripped the cloth. I lied, the sovereign said softly. The words lodged in the quiet room like a stone dropping through still water. He looked down at the rippling surface of the copper basin, watching his own reflection distort and settle. For 30 years I believed it to be true, but the moment I looked up at that gallery, Alice, the cold was gone. The older woman crossed her arms, leaning back against the stone wall. Her expression did not shift. Her shoulders simply dropped, carrying the physical weight of anticipating a very long political storm. Then we have a problem, she stated, her dry humor entirely absent. Because you just gave the elders your word that you would never seek a mate. And the woman you are currently smelling in the air happens to be the one recording that very promise. I know, he murmured, tossing the damp towel onto the table. He did not pace. He did not bare his fangs. He simply stood in the freezing room and let the reality of his situation settle into his bones. He would not force Clara Vance. He would not demand her presence, or override her quiet dignity with the brute strength of a biological tie. If he was going to approach her, it would have to be through the only language she trusted: ink, parchment, and absolute respect. The cold stone archive smelled of dry parchment, oxidized iron gall ink, and the sharp bite of beeswax. Clara Vance worked in the dimming afternoon light, moving between the towering oak shelves, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago learned how to disappear into her labor. The heavy iron clasps of the lesser ledgers clinked faintly as she realigned them along the cedar boards, restoring the physical geometry of the room. It was meticulous, unglamorous work, the kind of invisible effort that sustained the entire sovereign machinery without ever demanding a sliver of public recognition. She carried the bloodline registry back to her central desk, setting the massive leather-bound volume down upon a sheet of clean linen. The ancient book was heavy, its spine stiffened by centuries of ancestral pack lore. As her ink-stained fingertips brushed the worn cover, she noticed it again, a persistent, unnatural warmth lingering just beneath her skin. It was not the familiar ache of cold northern drafts, nor the sting of a fresh paper cut. It felt like a slow-burning ember lodged deep within her pulse, a physical aftershock of the exact moment the king's gaze had locked onto hers in the high gallery. Clara did not allow the sensation to dictate her movements. She had spent too much of her life surviving turbulent pack dynamics to surrender her composure to an unexplained physiological reaction. Instead, she let the knowledge of that warmth settle into her, isolating it as just another variable to be managed. She reached across the desk for her restoration tools. A secondary page near the back of the volume had suffered a jagged tear, likely caught beneath the rough edge of a careless elder's ring. Clara opened a small ceramic jar of specialized archival paste. The scent of crushed winter wheat and bitter almond filled the space between her and the desk. She picked up a fine, bristled brush, dipping it carefully into the pale mixture. She applied the pasta to the torn edges, holding her breath to prevent the slightest tremor in her hands. With the flat edge of a bone folder, she realigned the fragile fibers of the parchment, pressing them smooth against a temporary backing sheet. The work was a highly effective anchor. Here, in the quiet solitude of the archives, complex problems could be repaired with precision, patience, and the correct adhesive. There were no unpredictable political shifts to calculate, no grand speeches about the age of mating to decipher, and no suffocating alpha auras to navigate. There was only the physical document, the raw truth it held, and her responsibility to preserve it. She smoothed the mended page one final time, wiping a stray smear of paste from the pad of her thumb. The ledger was whole again. The light in the archive room shifted from pale grey to a deep, bruised violet as dusk fell over the citadel. Clara struck a match, lighting the tallow candle on her desk. The small flame illuminated the immediate circle of her workspace, but left the far corners of the hall draped in heavy shadow. The sound of footsteps approached down the outer corridor. They were heavy, measured, and distinctly unhurried. Most men of rank moved with a rushed sense of self-importance, letting their boots crack against the flagstones to announce their dominance. These steps were entirely different. They did not demand attention. They simply occupied the space with undeniable gravity. Before the visitor crossed the threshold, the footsteps paused. A brief, deliberate silence hung in the air, a calculated warning to ensure she was not caught off guard by a sudden entry. Only after that respectful pause did the heavy oak door push open. Darius Vaughan stepped into the archive room. The temperature in the chamber seemed to plunge, chased out by the scent of frost, crushed pine needles, and the sharp tang of ozone that always accompanied the sovereign. Clara stood up from her wooden chair, her hands automatically smoothing the front of her dark wool skirt. She did not curtsy, nor did she lower her eyes in the exaggerated submission demanded by lesser pack alphas. She simply held her posture straight, waiting for him to state his business. Darius did not cross the room to loom over her desk. He stopped precisely 3 paces away from the edge of the wood, a distance mandated by formal court etiquette, but rarely practiced in private. He wore a heavy black cloak trimmed in northern wolf fur, the silver clasps gleaming faintly in the candlelight. His hands were deliberately clasped behind his back. It was a posture of extreme physical restraint, a silent communication that he had no intention of crowding her territory. He wielded the wordless atmosphere like a physical tool, feeling no compulsion to shatter the calm with meaningless chatter. He was a man who could level a rebellious territory with a single command, yet here, surrounded by fragile paper and dry ink, he contained his sheer physical mass with terrifying discipline. "I apologize for the late hour, Archivist," Darius said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that did not need volume to carry across the cold stone room. "I have come to review the transcription of the afternoon's council session." Clara noted the visible tension in his broad shoulders, the careful way he kept his breathing shallow so as not to overwhelm the small, enclosed space with his scent. He was actively suppressing the biological dominance that naturally radiated from a king, prioritizing her emotional safety over his own comfort. "The transcription is prepared, Sovereign," Clara answered, her voice steady and clear. She did not rush. She picked up the freshly dried parchment from the corner of her desk and held it out toward him. Darius stepped forward exactly 1 pace. He unclasped his hands, took the document from her outstretched fingers without letting his gloves brush her skin, and stepped back to his original position. The boundary remained unbroken. Darius held the freshly dried vellum up to the amber light of the single beeswax candle burning on the reading desk. The iron gall ink had settled deep into the fibers, forming precise angular letters that possessed no flourish, only absolute clarity. Every ascender and descender was perfectly measured, devoid of the hurried panic that usually plagued the scribes who worked under the direct gaze of the sovereign. He read the paragraphs slowly, his eyes tracking the dark lines across the heavy page. The rhythm of his own speech from the council hall stared back at him, yet the architecture of the sentences felt subtly reinforced, stripped of the repetitive rhetorical weight the elders usually demanded. His thumb traced the margin, where a small correction had been notched into the parchment. The alteration was barely visible, executed with a razor-thin blade and smoothed over with bone before new ink was applied. The sovereign lowered the document. He did not step closer to the woman waiting across the cold stone floor. He simply let the parchment rest against the polished oak of the reading stand. "You altered the phrasing of the second decree," Darius noted. His voice remained in that low, measured register that required no volume to command a room. Clara stood 3 paces away. her hands folded over the dark linen of her apron. The cold draught from the high stone windows stirred the edges of her sleeves, but her posture did not break. She did not rush to apologize, or lower her chin in the customary trembling submission of a lower-ranked servant. "I adjusted the syntax, my king," Clara answered. Her tone was practical, devoid of the nervous flutter that usually accompanied any contradiction of his authority. "You stated in the hall that no elder shall not find their lineages unprotected by the crown." The double negative, when transcribed verbatim into the permanent record, creates a contradictory legal loophole. It implies the crown might actively seek out unprotected lineages to penalize them, rather than shielding them from external threat. Darius looked at her. He let the words hang in the space between them, letting the silence stretch until it filled the vast, shadowy corners of the archive. The scent of pine and crushed comfrey drifted from her side of the room, clean and utterly calm against the metallic chill of the ancient stronghold. "You corrected a sovereign declaration," he said, testing the weight of the boundary. "I preserved the legal integrity of the crown's records," Clara replied smoothly, meeting his stare without flinching. "A speech is meant to be felt by the room. A registry is meant to be upheld by the courts in 50 years. If the scribes leave a fracture in the grammar today, the border packs will use it to break the law tomorrow." The sovereign's gaze returned to the vellum. He ran his eyes over the precise, unhurried ink strokes that had saved his administration from a future decade of territorial litigation. Most archive keepers would have simply written his exact words, preferring the safety of blind obedience to the risk of critical thought. Darius felt a strange, quiet settling in his chest. It was not the sudden, violent rush of predatory instinct that the old tales claimed a mate bond should bring. It was something rarer. It was the profound relief of being understood by an intellect that did not require his supervision. He did not need to intimidate her into doing the work correctly, and she did not need his permission to be competent. "The adjustment stands," Darius said quietly. He set the parchment down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the desk. "It is a better law written this way." Clara gave a small, measured nod. She did not smile in victory. She simply accepted the acknowledgement as a factual reality, reaching for a clean linen cloth to wipe the lingering ink from her fingertips. The quiet between them shifted. The initial tension of the review dissolved into the cavernous stillness of the citadel's lower levels. The only sound remaining was the steady crackle of the hearth fire in the corner, chewing through dry cedar logs and throwing long, wavering shadows against the frost-rimmed stone. Darius did not leave the room. Instead, he moved his attention to the heavy, iron-clasped volume resting at the center of the Archivist's primary workstation, the Bloodline Registry. Its thick leather cover was cracked with centuries of cold air and handling, the corners reinforced with dull, tarnished silver. The book held the absolute history of the pack's lineage, matings, and successions within its bound pages, serving as the ultimate legal authority for every territorial claim made in the northern lands. The sheer physical weight of the ledger seemed to anchor the room, a silent witness to every sovereign who had stood where Darius now stood. "The elders believe my declaration today is without precedent," Darius murmured, looking down at the massive spine of the book. "They argued that an alpha who refuses to seek a mate breaks the foundational continuity of the North. They claim the registry demands a paired sovereign to maintain the stability of the borders." Clara paused in her cleaning. She laid the ink-stained cloth flat on the desk, her eyes tracking his gaze to the ancient ledger. "The elders have a poor memory for their own history," she said softly. He turned his head, granting her the floor without a single command, silently inviting her to continue. "In the 4th century of the Pack, Sovereign Valerius ruled for 40 years without recording a mate in the Bloodline Registry," Clara explained. Her voice took on the steady, rhythmic cadence of a scholar entirely deep in her element, unbothered by the rank of her audience. He named his brother's youngest son as his formal heir. The territory expanded by 300 leagues during his reign, and the internal trade laws were permanently stabilized. Before him, King Kalan outlived his mate and refused to take another, ruling alone for 2 decades while keeping the western border entirely secure. Darius absorbed the information, letting the historical facts settle over him like cold water into stone. He had known the histories, of course, but hearing them spoken back to him with such calm, unshakable certainty grounded the abstract arguments he had waged in the council hall. She was not offering him blind comfort or empty flattery. She was offering him documented, undeniable precedent. "They prefer to forget Valerius," Darius noted, his broad shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as the heavy mantle of the day's politics finally loosened. "His reign proves that stability comes from administrative order and careful governance, not just a biological mandate forced by blind tradition." "The registry does not care about their political preferences," Clara replied, tapping her clean fingers lightly against the edge of the desk. "It only records what survives the test of time." Silence returned to the archive, but its texture had irrevocably changed. It was no longer the cautious, guarded quiet of 2 strangers assessing a threat across a dividing line. It was a comfortable, heavy stillness, anchored by the heat of the fire and the dry, rich scent of aged parchment. The Alpha King inhabited the tranquility with an unshakable stillness, resting in the absence of sound rather than fighting it. For the first time in years, the sovereign did not feel the exhausting need to manage the air in the room. He could simply exist within it, unburdened by the constant surveillance of his court. Clara remained at her station, systematically organizing her brass quills and capping her inkwells, perfectly content to share the unspoken weight of the moment. Her presence demanded nothing of him. She did not project expectation, nor did she shrink from his massive physical proximity. The cedar fire popped, sending a brief, bright spark against the iron grate. Darius watched the reflection of the small flame flicker in Clara's dark eyes as she briefly looked up from her work. They held the gaze, separated by a wooden desk and 1,000 years of pack law, yet bound by a mutual, quiet recognition. It was a slow, deliberate alignment of minds, far stronger than any impulsive decree the High Council could ever write. 2 weeks later, the scent of aging vellum, dried beeswax, and cold iron was a familiar comfort, a quiet barrier against the relentless political machinery of the citadel above. Clara stood beside the reading table, smoothing the brittle edges of a 17th century ledger. The afternoon light had already shifted into a bruised, wintry purple. She was cataloguing the northern boundary deeds when the heavy oak door swung inward, striking the stone wall with enough force to rattle the iron hinges. The disruption tore through the meticulous silence. Marcus Thule did not merely enter a space, he invaded it. His heavy boots struck the flagstones with deliberate weight. The air grew thick with the overwhelming scent of wet earth and territorial musk, the signature of an elder who relied entirely on physical dominance. Ignoring the brass line on the floor that designated the visitor's boundary, he marched directly toward her workspace. Clara did not flinch. She simply picked up a smooth lead weight, placed it carefully over the corner of the exposed vellum document, and folded her hands over her dark linen apron. "I require the territorial deeds for the shattered peaks," Marcus demanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He planted both of his large hands heavily on the edge of her wooden desk, leaning his considerable bulk forward. "The original drafting maps from the Third Council. Bring them to my quarters before nightfall." Clara looked down at his scarred knuckles. She did not raise her chin in defiance, nor did she lower her gaze in submission. She observed him with the detached calculation of a ledger keeper identifying a mathematical error. "The shattered peaks deeds are classified under the sovereign mandate," Clara said. Her voice was a flat, even tone that offered him no emotional purchase. "They cannot be removed from this room." nor can they be viewed without a formally signed warrant from the High Council or the king himself. Marcus narrowed his pale eyes, a muscle feathering along his jawline. Do you know who I am, Archivist? I am Elder Thule. I do not ask for permission to view the history of my own pack's borders. I am giving you a direct order, and I am giving you the exact administrative protocol, Clara replied, her voice quiet. Subsection 4. Paragraph 9 of the Citadel Archival Code dictates that unauthorized access to active border treaties constitutes treason against the Crown. I will not commit treason to facilitate your reading habits, Elder. Marcus leaned closer, trying to force her to shrink from his oppressive aura. Clara held her ground, her posture a straight, unyielding line. She understood the mechanics of bullies perfectly. Deprived of fear, they possessed only bluster. You hide behind dusty technicalities because you have no wolf to protect you, Marcus sneered, his lip curling in contempt. But paper burns, little scribe. If you wish to requisition the documents, present a valid wax seal, Clara answered, ignoring his crude threat entirely. Otherwise, the archive is officially closed to you. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, finding absolutely nothing to exploit. With a sharp exhale of frustration, he pushed roughly off the desk and strode out. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, sending a cloud of cold dust into the fading light. Clara exhaled a slow, perfectly controlled breath. She reached out and adjusted the lead weight, her ink-stained fingers completely steady. The reverberation of the slammed door had barely faded when a new presence manifested in the room. There were no heavy footsteps, no aggressive projection of power. Instead, the oppressive scent of Marcus's musk was smoothly overwritten by the clean, sharp fragrance of winter pine, cold ozone, and cedarwood. Clara did not startle. She turned slightly to see Sovereign King Darius Vaughan stepping out from the shadows of the adjacent historical gallery. He must have been standing among the imposing stacks for some time, observing the exchange in perfect silence. The sovereign existed comfortably within the stillness, projecting a calm dominance that required no vocalization. He moved toward her reading table with slow, measured steps, keeping his hands loosely clasped behind his back. He did not cross the brass boundary line on the floor, respecting the invisible perimeter she had established around her workspace. Elder Thule possesses many traits, Darius said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that carried easily through the quiet room. Respect for administrative procedure has never been one of them. He believes his rank supersedes the Citadel Archival Code, Clara replied, her tone matching his measured cadence. She began to neatly realign the requisition forms Marcus had disrupted, a common misconception among the elders. They assume the ink belongs to them simply because they rule the land it describes. Darius let a subtle expression of approval touch his eyes. He did not offer empty praise for her bravery, nor did he adopt a patronizing tone of protection. You did not yield an inch, he noted, his gaze tracking the precise, unhurried movements of her hands. Yielding to intimidation sets a terrible precedent for record-keeping, Clara answered plainly. If I give him the Shattered Peaks deeds today without a warrant, he will demand the Royal Treasury ledgers tomorrow. Darius stepped up to the brass line. Slowly, he unclasped a hand from behind his back and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. It bore the heavy impression of his personal sovereign seal. He slid the document across the polished oak, stopping just short of her lead weight. Then it is fortunate that I have brought the proper paperwork, Darius said quietly. Clara looked down at the sealed parchment, then back up to his face. A warrant for the deeds? A formal mandate, Darius corrected, his voice dropping to a softer register that remained entirely devoid of coercion. An official request for your partnership. Marcus Thule is searching for something specific in those border treaties. Something he wishes to bury before the Winter Tribunal. He left the document resting on the table, making no move to push it into her hands. I am commissioning a full audit of the Shattered Peaks treaties, Darius continued, holding her gaze with steady respect. "But I will not order you to undertake this task. The danger is real, and the choice must be yours. If you accept, you will work directly under my seal. No elder will have the authority to question your access." Clara stared at the heavy red wax, analyzing the weight of the protection he was offering. It was not a command disguised as a favor. It was an invitation to stand as an intellectual equal. She picked up the parchment, breaking the seal with a clean snap. "We should begin with the cartography records of the Third Council," Clara said. Darius did not smile, but the atmosphere in the room settled into a profound, shared stillness. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute acknowledgement. The archive room at midnight possessed a specific gravity, a stillness built from centuries of undisturbed paper and cold mortared stone. The only light came from 3 thick beeswax candles, their amber glow fighting a losing battle against the drafts that bled through the high windows. Clara Vance sat at the far southern edge of the central oak reading table. Darius Vaughan sat precisely at the northern edge. The physical distance between them was vast, measuring nearly 10 feet of scarred wood, yet the atmospheric pressure in the room felt incredibly dense. He watched her work. He did not ask her to begin the review of the documents immediately. Instead, he simply rested his forearms against the table and observed the systematic methodology of her preparation. Clara avoided the heavy iron gall ink provided by the Citadel's central scribes. It was too acidic, prone to burning through the fragile fibers of ancestral records. She had brought her own supplies in a small wooden box. She retrieved a shallow ceramic dish, a vial of distilled water, and a tightly stoppered glass jar containing fine, dark powder. It was soot harvested from burned pine, refined and sifted until it was lighter than breath. With measured, unhurried movements, she tapped a small amount of the ash into the dish. She added water drop by drop from a glass pipette. She did this not because she was attempting to delay the work, but because the historical ledgers demanded absolute precision. Standard ink dried too slowly, smearing under the heel of a hand, or too quickly, leaving jagged marginalia. Her diluted ash ink dried almost instantly upon hitting the parchment, allowing for clean, meticulous corrections that would survive another century. Darius watched the rhythmic motion of her wooden stirring stick. His gaze was heavy, carrying the weight of a man who commanded legions and negotiated with hostile factions. Yet he remained perfectly still. The sovereign king of the north was allowing his schedule to be dictated by the mixture of ash and water. "The standard scribe ink bites through the vellum," Clara said quietly, keeping her focus on the ceramic dish. It was the first time either of them had spoken in 20 minutes. "The acidity ruins the older cartography lines. This mixture is softer. It sits on the surface." "You take great care with things that have already survived for centuries," Darius answered. His voice was a low, resonant rumble in the drafty room, devoid of the command tone he used in the council hall. "Things survive because someone takes care of them," Clara replied, "not because they are naturally indestructible." She wiped the edge of her stirring stick with a linen cloth, arranged her quills, and aligned her blotting paper. Only when the geometry of her workstation was flawless did she finally look up across the expanse of the oak table. He was still watching her, his posture relaxed, his authority entirely contained within his own boundaries. He had not crossed into her space or rushed her. He had simply waited, proving his respect through absolute patience. She reached into the protective leather cylinder resting beside her chair and withdrew the document they had agreed to catalogue. The Treaty of the Shattered Peaks. The parchment was extraordinarily thick, cured from winter hides, but age had turned its edges brittle and rigid. As Clara attempted to unfurl the scroll, the stiff material fought back, curling stubbornly inward like a closed fist. She pressed her palms flat against the bottom edge, but the top immediately rolled up, knocking over one of the brass paperweights. Darius stood, Moving without sudden, jarring speed, he closed the distance between them with slow, measured steps, stopping precisely at the midpoint of the table. He reached out with one large, scarred hand and pressed his palm flat against the top edge of the treaty, pinning it securely to the wood. Clara moved to the middle of the table, standing opposite him, her hands holding the bottom edge flat. Between them lay the geography of the northern borderlands, drawn in fading iron ink and marked by crack drops of crimson wax. The shattered peaks were depicted as a jagged spine of triangles, the ink rivers winding through the valleys like dark veins. They both leaned over the table to examine a specific cartographical anomaly near the eastern ridge. Clara kept her index finger pressed firmly against the brittle surface of the disputed border accord. The air between them shifted, growing heavy with the scent of crushed pine needles, cold ozone, and the metallic tang of old blood. Her own scent, a quiet blend of dry parchment, lavender, and wood smoke, rose to meet it. As she moved her hand to point out a discrepancy in the elevation markers, Darius shifted his grip on the parchment to smooth a wrinkle in the hide. Their knuckles brushed. It was not a collision. It was a faint, accidental sliding of skin against skin over a map of a broken mountain. The reaction was instantaneous. A deep, resonant pressure spiked in the air, a physical weight that pressed against the stones of the archive. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The heat radiating from his knuckles seeped through her skin, threatening to override the cold, analytical detachment she had spent years perfecting. She felt the particular kind of pull that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. She held entirely still, refusing the instinct to snatch her hand away in a display of frightened modesty. Darius also froze. The king went completely rigid, the muscles in his forearm locking like wrought iron. His eyes lifted from the faded map, locking onto hers in the amber candlelight. The silence in the room was absolute, stretching taut between them. For 3 long heartbeats, neither of them moved. Clara let the sensation settle into her, analyzing the overwhelming physiological demand of the bond, recognizing its power, and deliberately choosing to breathe through it. She maintained her steady posture, refusing to yield her composure to a biological imperative. Seeing her control, the tension in his jaw slowly released. Instead of attempting to capture her hand or lean closer, he very carefully shifted his fingers a fraction of an inch to the left, breaking the contact while keeping the parchment securely pinned. "The elevation line here," Clara said, her voice perfectly level, though her fingers gripped the quill a fraction tighter than before. "It does not match the written boundaries in the secondary text." Darius looked down at the map, his breathing slow and fiercely controlled. "Show me," he answered, his voice a low gravel that resonated against the wood. The ambient cold of the archive room seemed to fracture at the exact center of the long oak table. Keeping her focus entirely on the faded ink, Clara allowed her breathing to remain shallow and measured in the freezing air. "Read the 3rd line of the territorial concession," she said quietly. Darius shifted. The subtle movement brought the faint, heavy scent of winter pine and impending snow into her immediate breathing space. He braced his large hands on the carved edge of the wood, deliberately keeping his arms clear of her chair. Leaning forward, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the ancient maps, he read the archaic script. "The boundary shall hold the valley of ash, extending through the western pass, inclusive of the timberline." He recited the words with a slow, resonant precision that vibrated faintly against the stone floor. It is the exact text Marcus recited at the Autumn Council. It is the legal basis for their logging camps. "It is what the text sounds like when spoken aloud," Clara corrected, sliding her neatly trimmed nail half an inch to the right. "But look closely at the syntax. Look at the specific physical spacing between the word pass and the word inclusive." The sovereign looked. He was a man who understood the complex geometries of battlefields, and as he stared at the parchment, she watched him apply that same ruthless, predatory intelligence to the architecture of grammar. "There is no pause," he murmured. His breath stirred a few stray dust motes, dancing in the ambient candlelight. "A dependent clause without a comma changes the entire subject of the modifier," Clara explained, her tone slipping into the crisp, objective cadence of a scholar. "It does not mean the valley includes the timberline. It means the western pass itself is the only geographical feature defined by the timberline. The Thule family has claimed 60 miles of silver pine forest based on a deliberate grammatical assumption. The silence that settled over the table was absolute, rather than roaring in sudden anger or cursing his council elders. Darius absorbed the magnitude of the betrayal with the terrifying calm of a king who had just been handed the master key to his enemy's fortress. He turned his head slowly, looking down at her. His eyes were entirely dark, reflecting the small, steady flames of the beeswax candles. The physical proximity between them crackled, heavy with the sudden, unspoken realization that her quiet mind was the most dangerous weapon in his kingdom. It was not a physical mating pull that held him frozen in the drafty room. It was the sheer, undeniable force of identical intellectual integrity. "A missing mark of ink," the king said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. 80 years of violent border skirmishes. 3 generations of Thule elders sitting in my hall, demanding military tribute for land they never legally owned. It could have been a simple scribal error, Clara noted softly, though the steady, uncompromising line of her mouth suggested otherwise. Or it could have been a sharp knife point, scraping the parchment clean before the ink fully dried to the vellum. If you examine the texture under the candlelight, the hide is dangerously thin, right exactly where the punctuation should be. Darius stepped back, giving her air. The shift in his stance was a deliberate withdrawal of physical pressure, a profound gesture of respect. Letting that knowledge settle into him like cold water into stone, he simply nodded. "You have dismantled a violent dynasty with a fingernail, Clara Vance." Dawn brought a grey, unforgiving light through the high eastern windows of the citadel. Clara sat alone at her separate desk, her hands occupied with the meticulous daily work of sharpening fresh quills. The small iron penknife made a rhythmic, dry scraping sound against the hollow stems of the large goose feathers. Alice stood in the open doorway, holding a thick ceramic cup of black tea that smelled of bitter roots and morning frost. The supporting archivist did not enter immediately. She stood watching the younger woman work, her gruff face lined with a deep practical exhaustion that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. "You are standing in the shadow of a very large tree," Alice said finally. She stepped into the cold room and set the steaming cup near the heavy brass inkwell. "When lightning strikes the high branches, the things standing on the bare ground tend to burn first." Without flinching or pausing her work, Clara carefully tested the edge of the blade against the pad of her thumb, checking the precise angle of the cut. "Good morning to you as well, Alice." "Do not use that polite, flat tone with me," the older woman grumbled, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Her heavy wool shawl smelled strongly of lye and hearth smoke. "Marcus Thule has loyal eyes in the servant corridors. He knows the sovereign stayed in this archive past midnight. Men like Marcus do not care if you are merely translating old texts. They care that the king stays to listen to you. You are making yourself a visible target in a game played with fangs." Clara set the iron knife down on the blotter. She picked up the newly sharpened quill, dipped the fresh tip into the black ink, and pressed it to a scrap of waste parchment. She drew a single flawless straight line. The ink did not bleed into the fibers. The edge was perfectly sharp. "I am not playing a game," Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly level, "and I am not standing in anyone's shadow. I am doing the exact job I was assigned." "Your job was to copy standard birth records," Alice countered sharply, "not to unearth centuries of territorial fraud against the most aggressive beta family in the north. The historical records are exactly what they are." Clara wiped the metal nib clean with a soft linen cloth. She did not feel the sudden frantic panic that usually seized lower-ranking wolves when threatened by high-born alphas. She felt the particular kind of peace that comes not from ignorance, but from absolute preparation. The world outside the archive was entirely corrupt, but the math inside it remained pure. Marcus relies on noise, he relies on physical intimidation, loud claims to power, and the fear of his retaliation. The parchment does not care how loud he yells. Alice sighed, a harsh, scraping sound that ruffled the loose papers resting on the nearest wooden shelf. The parchment cannot stop a knife in the dark, girl. No, Clara agreed quietly, aligning her finished quills in a neat parallel row on the edge of her desk. But the Sovereign can, and Darius is a man who protects his assets. She said his name without hesitation. Not because she presumed any foolish romantic intimacy, but because she recognized the exact architecture of the alliance they were quietly building. It was not built on the chaotic biological heat of a forced bond. It was built on the undeniable gravity of objective truth. When Darius returned to the archives the following evening to continue their audit, Clara traced a line on the parchment without leaning into the warmth, radiating from the Sovereign, sitting across the table. Her boundaries remained a physical architecture in the room, an invisible line drawn between his side of the heavy oak desk and hers. The mate bond might have hummed beneath her ribs, thick and insistent, carrying the sharp, clean scent of winter pine and ozone, but she refused to let biology override the methodical cadence of her work. She kept her posture straight, her focus anchored to the brittle pages illuminated by a single beeswax candle. The flame wavered in the drafty air, casting long, shifting shadows against the stone walls. Darius watched the deliberate way she pressed the edge of her thumbnail against a misaligned seam in the binding of a secondary record. He refrained from asking intrusive questions, allowing the silence to settle until it became a space she could choose to fill. He occupied that silence without the nervous impulse to force intimacy, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that true trust could not be commanded. The northern markers were shifted twice before the frost of my 12th winter, Clara said. Her voice was low, measured, and entirely free of the tremor that usually accompanied such admissions. She did not look up from the text. My family held a small acreage near the White Pine Crossing. It was not a strategic position. It offered no military advantage to the pack. It was simply land, with enough fertile soil to grow root vegetables and graze a small herd. She dipped her quill into the dark ash ink. The scratch of the metal nib against the rough paper was the only sound in the cavernous archive, a steady, grounding rhythm against the pressure of her memory. When the High Council allowed the local lords to reinterpret the phrasing of the Defense Pact, the border became a matter of opinion rather than geography. She continued, her words precise and analytical. An ambiguous adjective in a translated document gave the Eastern patrols the right to clear the valley for what they called necessary fortification. My parents did not survive the clearing. They were collateral damage to a badly drafted sentence. She finally lifted her gaze to meet his. There were no tears in her eyes. Years of navigating the ruthless hierarchy of the pack had taught her to lock away her vulnerability where cruel onlookers could never reach it. Instead, there was only the cold, hard clarity of a woman who understood that violence was rarely born from malice alone. It was usually born from poorly written laws and the arrogance of those who refused to read them. That is why I check the grammar, she stated quietly, setting the quill aside so the ink would not blot. A misplaced comma is an open gate, a vague pronoun is a burning house. I ensure the records are exact because I know exactly what it costs when they are not. Darius Vaughan received this truth with the same absolute stillness he used to govern. There was no reach across the table for a comforting touch, no hollow apology for a systemic failure that had occurred decades before his reign. He simply sat in the dim amber light, absorbing the weight of her history without trying to diminish it with pity or empty reassurances. "Then we will ensure the grammar of this administration is unyielding," the king said. The low timbre of his voice carried no commanding alpha resonance, only the quiet gravity of a vow. "Your vigilance will lock the gates. No more ambiguous adjectives. No more burning houses. You have my word on that, Clara." With that promise anchoring the air between them, they turned their full attention back to the treaty of the shattered peaks. The ancient parchment smelled faintly of dust, crushed lavender, and dry resin, its edges flaking onto the polished oak wood like winter frost. Clara pulled a heavy ledger closer, carefully comparing the original syntax of the border agreement with the secondary decrees filed over the last century by Marcus Thule's lineage. Here, she pointed to a faded line of script near the bottom margin of the third scroll. Her ink-stained finger rested just below a string of archaic northern terms that dictated land usage. The Thule estate bases their entire territorial expansion on the provision of active stewardship. They argue before the council that by patrolling the outer crags, they possess the sovereign right to the timber harvests and the valley toll roads. Darius leaned forward slightly, still respecting the invisible boundary she had maintained, and studied the text following her gesture. The shifting shadows from the candle flickered across the sharp angles of his jaw as his eyes tracked the dense, complicated script. "But the original clause does not grant ownership through patrol," Clara explained, her analytical mind cutting through the convoluted legal framework. "It states quite clearly that active stewardship is a tax-burden duty, not a property right. The subsequent document, the one Marcus relies upon to justify his claims, conveniently omitted the taxation appendix when it was transcribed 50 years ago. He is not guarding the border. He is occupying it." The realization settled into the room like a heavy stone dropping through still water. Clara smoothly unrolled a secondary topographical map, using small brass weights to hold down the corners. She aligned the geographical coordinates mentioned in the treaty with the financial records she had pulled from the lower vault. Earlier that evening, the evidence was mathematically undeniable. Marcus Thule had not been defending the realm against external threats. He had been systematically annexing crown land and evading the associated tariffs through a deliberate clerical error. Darius traced the line of the old border on the map, his expression hardening as the full scope of the fraud became clear. The territorial friction that had plagued his council for years, the constant demands for increased military budgets, was not a matter of aggression from rival pacts. It was an administrative theft, hidden in plain sight by the very elder who demanded war to protect his own stolen assets. He slowly straightened up, letting his hand drop from the map. The tension in his broad shoulders shifted, transforming from the burden of a looming conflict into the quiet certainty of a trap, perfectly calibrated and ready to be sprung. He looked at Clara, taking in the smudge of ink on her cuff, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the sharp, uncompromising intelligence in her eyes. She had dismantled a political crisis without ever lifting a blade. "I have spent the last 3 seasons positioning battalions along the southern ridge, preparing for a war I could not logically justify," Darius said quietly. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute respect in his tone resonated off the cold stone walls, thick with genuine admiration. "You have solved with a quill what my army could not with steel." Clara folded her hands in her lap, letting the magnitude of the legal victory settle between them. The fragile parchment was no longer just a piece of history. It was a weapon, perfectly honed and ready for the winter tribunal. The iron hinges of the great council hall screamed in protest as the heavy oak doors were sealed from the inside, trapping the scent of melting tallow and anxious breath within the circular chamber. Marcus Thule did not wait for the ceremonial hearth fire to catch. He strode to the center of the sunken floor, his boots striking the cold slate with deliberate aggression. In his hands he carried a heavy roll of vellum, bound in a red ribbon, signaling a formal territorial dispute. He threw it down upon the central viewing table. The crack of the unrolling parchment echoed up into the vaulted ceiling. He smoothed the edges flat, his gold signet ring clicking against the stone. The northern border is bleeding, and the crown does nothing but watch the snow fall, the elder declared, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a military tribunal. He pointed a thick finger at the painted lines on his map. For 3 generations, my family sentries have patrolled the outer ridges of the shattered peaks. The land beyond the river has always fallen under our administrative jurisdiction. I claim emergency sovereignty over the eastern ridge, dictated by these ancient patrol lines. Darius sat motionless in the high seat. The sovereign did not lean forward to inspect the document. He simply rested his hands on the carved arms of his chair, watching the challenger with the terrifying stillness of a lodestone waiting for iron. The king knew exactly what this was. It was not a plea for security. It was a systemic land fraud disguised as patriotism. Marcus pressed his advantage, misreading the silence as hesitation. The records are clear, Your Majesty. I have brought the updated cartography, verified by my surveyors this morning. The old archives are dust and memory. There is nothing in the Citadel's possession that contradicts the boundaries drawn here today. If the crown cannot secure the territory, the Thule lineage will. Up in the shadows of the registry gallery, a chair scraped softly against the wooden floorboards. The sound was faint, barely louder than a dying ember settling in the hearth, but in the tense geometry of the council hall, it was enough to draw every eye upward toward the balcony. Clara Vance stood. She did not rush. She picked up a cylindrical leather case from her desk, securing the brass clasps with ink-stained fingers that did not tremble. Then she began her slow descent down the iron spiral staircase. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the metal grate, but the entire room seemed to hold its breath as she moved through the shafts of winter sunlight. She wore the plain grey wool of a Citadel archivist, her posture impeccably straight, entirely unaffected by the hostile glares of the military commanders gathered below. When she reached the council floor, she walked directly to the opposite side of the slate slab facing Marcus, the elder sneered. "Go back to your inkpots, scribe," Marcus dismissed her. "This is a matter of territorial security, not a spelling lesson." Clara ignored him. She set the leather case on the table, unfastened the latches, and drew out a scroll of brittle, yellowed parchment. The smell of cedar resin and centuries-old iron gall ink spilled into the space between them. It was the Treaty of the Shattered Peaks, preserved perfectly in the cold dark. She unrolled it carefully, placing weights on the curling corners beside the challenger's map. The document presented by Elder Thule is a masterful piece of illustration, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, yet it possessed a calm acoustic quality that projected effortlessly into the highest arches of the stone hall. She did not plead for attention. She simply stated facts into the silence. But it is fiction. I am the keeper of the bloodline registry, and I hold the original decree of the Eastern Ridge, she continued, her tone as measured and cool as winter water. She placed a slender finger on the ancient map, tracing a faded blue ink line. Your surveyors have moved the river boundary 2 miles west. A clever adjustment, designed to subsume the iron-rich valleys into your ancestral estate. She tapped the bottom margin of the parchment, where meticulous handwriting documented the legal boundaries. The text states that the Thule jurisdiction ends where the shadow of the great pine falls at the winter solstice. Your map claims the boundary is where the shadow of the mountain falls. You have altered a single noun in your modern translation, effectively stealing 2 miles of sovereign land. The council erupted into overlapping whispers. Marcus slammed his hand onto the slate, a mere technicality, brought up by a girl who knows nothing of how the real world operates. It is not an error when the ink on your map is still off-gassing modern chemical binding agents, Clara pointed out, her gaze locking onto the elder without a flinch. "Your document was drafted less than 48 hours ago. The paper grain matches the surplus stock requisitioned by your quartermaster last Tuesday. This is a calculated forgery." The silence that followed pressed down upon the room like physical weight. Marcus looked wildly toward the high seat, expecting the sovereign to banish the insolent woman. Darius remained perfectly still. His eyes were fixed entirely on the woman standing at the table, a profound respect softening the hard lines of his jaw. He did not need to raise his voice to shift the balance of power. He merely had to validate her presence. "The Archivist's evidence is documented, sealed, and verified," Darius stated, his voice a low, measured rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "The Crown recognizes the original Treaty of the Shattered Peaks as the sole legal authority of the northern border. Your claim is nullified." Clara did not smile triumphantly. She simply rolled the fragile parchment back into its protective case, her task complete. The truth had been officially recorded, and no amount of blustering volume could erase the ink she guarded. The heavy parchment of the ancient border pact lay perfectly flat against the scarred surface of the central ironwood table. 6 High Council elders leaned over the ancient document, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the cold stone floor of the great council hall. The silence in the room was no longer the polite, deferential quiet of a routine political hearing. It was the suffocating, heavy stillness of a systemic lie being dragged into the brutal light of day. Clara Vance stood 2 paces behind the crescent of elevated wooden chairs, her hands folded neatly over the coarse fabric of her dark linen skirt. She offered no impassioned rhetoric or further vocal explanation to defend her findings. The syntax of the second territorial clause required no translation. Elder Harron, the oldest of the traditionalists, traced the fading iron gall ink with a gnarled, trembling finger. He reread the precise boundary delineations that Marcus Thule had spent a decade intentionally misinterpreting. The cartographical lines drawn along the northern ridge were absolute. The legal loophole that Marcus had used to justify aggressive border patrols and illegal land seizures simply did not exist. The original scribes had been meticulous, and the quiet archivist had been equally meticulous in unearthing their work. Marcus stood rigid near the great stone hearth, the dying firelight catching the tight, bloodless line of his jaw. The arrogant gatekeeper had built his entire political foundation on the premise of military expansion, inherited privilege, and physical intimidation. Now a woman with ink-stained fingers and a steady gaze had systematically dismantled his borders, using nothing but a perfectly preserved manuscript. "This document is a forgery," Marcus stated, though his voice lacked its usual booming resonance. The accusation sounded thin, desperate, and hollow against the high vaulted ceiling of the citadel. Darius Vaughan offered no booming command or display of primal alpha dominance. He occupied the tense silence with a terrifying, absolute certainty. The king simply reached out and tapped a single, heavy knuckle against the iron-clasped corner of the historical treaty. "The wax seal of the first sovereign remains completely unbroken," the king said, his tone as measured and cold as a winter river. "The vellum has been verified by the Citadel's own alchemists. You are not arguing against a scribe. You are arguing against the foundation of our Pax laws." The other council members slowly shifted away from the disgraced elder. The physical distance was small. A half-step backward, a turned shoulder, a lowering of the eyes, but in the strict, unforgiving hierarchy of the Northern Pax, it was an immediate and permanent exile. "Sign the relinquishment order," the Alpha King commanded quietly. A lower clerk hurried forward, carrying a fresh sheet of heavy administrative parchment and a sharply cut quill. He set the items on a small writing desk beside an open inkwell, then backed away quickly. Marcus stared at the feather as if it were a drawn blade. He looked to his former allies for any sign of support, finding only cold, averted gazes. Slowly, heavily, the defeated man stepped forward. His knuckles turned bone-white as he gripped the quill. When he pressed the metal nib to the paper, his hands shook so violently that the dark ink splattered across the signature line in jagged, ugly drops. The scratching sound of the pen moving across the rough parchment was loud and full of impotent, trapped rage. Darius watched him in silent satisfaction. His posture was entirely relaxed, his shoulders loose, but his authority was absolute. The sovereign had won a multi-territory war and rooted out deep systemic corruption without shedding a single drop of blood on the council floor. As the clerk carried the signed document away to be pressed with the official state wax, the ambient tension in the great hall slowly decompressed. The sharp scent of bitter copper, fear, and ozone faded, replaced once again by the steady, familiar aroma of melting beeswax candles, old pine wood, and cold stone. Clara took a quiet breath, the frigid air filling her lungs and settling her racing pulse. Her duty for the afternoon was complete. She turned slightly, preparing to step back into the drafty shadows of the upper gallery where she had spent so many invisible years. Clara. The king's voice stopped her mid-step. It was not a royal summons barked across a crowded room, but a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement. The entire council turned their collective attention toward her. Refusing to flinch under the sudden weight of their scrutiny, she simply turned back to face him, keeping her posture straight, her hands steady, and her expression entirely composed. Darius stepped down from the elevated wooden dais. He bypassed the murmuring council members, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone as he closed the physical distance between the throne and the archival witness. He stopped precisely 2 feet in front of her. It was close enough that she could feel the ambient warmth radiating from his large frame, yet far enough to perfectly honor the invisible personal boundary she always meticulously maintained. A pack cannot survive on military strength and inherited rank alone, Darius said, his low, resonant voice carrying effortlessly to the farthest corners of the silent hall. We endure because our history is preserved, our laws are respected, and our truth is protected by those who possess the rare discipline to watch and record. He reached into the deep, fur-lined pocket of his dark velvet cloak, bringing out no traditional mate's claiming collar or token of biological destiny that would reduce her to a royal possession. He instead withdrew a heavy, gold-trimmed scribe's seal. The intricate metal caught the warm amber light of the nearest candelabra, gleaming with the ancient insignia of the inner sovereign court. By the absolute authority of the sovereign registry, I elevate you to the title of Grand Archivist and Counselor of the Realm, Darius declared, his eyes never leaving hers. He held the heavy seal out, resting it on his open palm. Clara looked down at the object. It was a tool of immense administrative and political power, a physical key that would grant her unrestricted access to every locked ledger, diplomatic treaty, and historical vault in the northern citadel. It meant she would never again be relegated to the freezing upper gallery. It meant a permanent, undeniable seat at the central table. She reached out slowly, her cool, ink-stained fingers brushing the heated metal as she accepted the insignia. The gold was heavy. It felt exactly right in her palm, anchoring her to the physical reality of her new standing. When she finally raised her eyes to meet the sovereign's gaze, she saw no possessive demand or aggressive alpha instinct trying to override her autonomy. She saw only profound, absolute respect for her mind and a patient readiness to stand beside her as an equal. The stone corridors of the Vaughan citadel had grown quiet by the time the evening bells tolled the end of the winter tribunal. The great iron doors of the High Council Hall were bolted shut. Down in the lower levels, the archive room offered a profound contrast. Here, the air smelled of dried rosemary, aged parchment, and the clean burn of beeswax candles. The heavy oak table, usually buried beneath disputed land claims, had been cleared. The bloodline registry rested under the amber light, its iron clasps undone. Darius Vaughan stood by the far wall, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow against the limestone. He had removed his heavy ceremonial cloak, leaving only his dark tunic and leather bracers. He occupied the room with the measured stillness of a man who knew precisely how much air he required, refusing to take a single breath more. His gaze remained fixed on the ancient ledger. Clara Vance stood opposite him, hands folded neatly over her grey linen dress. The ink stains on her fingers were fresh from the day's rigorous documentation. The chill of the drafty council gallery had finally faded from her bones, replaced by the warmth of the archive's hearth. She looked at the open book, recognizing the intricate calligraphy documenting centuries of Alpha successions. The page currently displayed ended with the king's own name, leaving the blank line beneath it stretching into eternity. When I stood before the elders in the autumn, Darius began, his voice low. I declared that I had outlived the necessity of finding a mate. I stated my blood had grown too cold for the irrational fever of a biological bond. He stepped forward with deliberate slowness. His boots made almost no sound on the worn flagstones. He stopped a full 3 paces away, ensuring she never felt pressured by his physical proximity. The faint scent of pine oil and ozone drifted from him. I was not entirely wrong, the Sovereign continued. I do not want an alliance built on the frantic loss of control, where choice is erased by necessity. I want a partnership rooted in evidence, in shared intellect, and in the conscious decision to stand beside one another every single day. Clara kept her posture perfectly straight. She had spent years documenting the disastrous consequences of forced pairings and desperate alliances. To hear a powerful ruler articulate the very boundaries she had built around her own heart was a profound validation. Not because it promised a crown, but because it promised safety. Darius reached toward the small wooden tray beside the ledger. He picked up the heavy iron gall inkwell used for permanent decrees, along with the sharpest of her goose feather quills, setting them down with precision on the right side of the parchment. Then he retreated to the edge of the hearth's glow. I am asking you to write the next chapter of this territory, Darius said quietly, not as a subject drafted into service, and not as an archivist recording the deeds of others. I am asking you to record your own name, Clara, beside mine. A permanent alliance, registered in law, sealed by your own hand, only if you find the terms acceptable. He asked for no immediate answer, simply standing by the fire to offer her the absolute freedom of choice. The silence that fell between them was a shared, spacious quiet. It was the stillness of 2 hyper-vigilant minds finally recognizing they no longer needed to scan the perimeter for threats. Clara studied the steadfast respect in his posture. He was a leader who could have ordered 100 scribes to forge whatever reality he desired, yet he waited for a solitary woman to decide if his reality was worth joining. Slowly, she closed the distance to the oak table. The thick vellum was cool beneath her fingertips as she smoothed the right-hand page. She picked up the quill, its familiar weight settling into the groove of her index finger. She dipped the nib into the dark ink, tapping the excess against the rim of the glass well. She did not look at Darius as she brought the tip to the parchment, but she felt his attention entirely focused on her hands. The scratch of the nib against the paper was the only sound in the room. Her handwriting was as it always was, elegant, precise, and entirely legible. She formed each syllable with the care of a woman constructing her own definitive truth. When the final letter was drawn, Clara set the tool down. She stepped back, aligning her stance with the king's. Darius leaned over the table, just enough to read the fresh script. There, beside the authoritative record of the Vaughan lineage, sat her name. It was not a subjugation. It was an equalization. The arrangement they had built over the past months had said nothing of sudden biological madness. It spoke of corrected grammar, historical boundaries, mutual protection, and intellectual parity. We kept exactly those promises, Clara thought, feeling a profound sense of safety take root in her chest. Darius exhaled, a quiet breath that seemed to release decades of solitary vigilance. He turned to look at her, the rigid tension in his jaw completely gone. He reached out, his scarred hand moving slowly to telegraph his intent. Clara did not step away. She lifted her ink-stained fingers and placed them into his palm. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly gentle, acknowledging the monumental weight of the choice she had just recorded. They stood together in front of the library hearth, the dying embers crackling softly against the iron grate. The winter wind howled against the high windows, but the cold could not penetrate the thick limestone walls. They watched the ink dry slowly on the page of the ancient ledger. Their bond was no longer an abstract theory. It was a tangible fact, forever preserved in law, anchored by respect and sealed by the quietest, most undeniable form of power.